I go to fashion school in New York City, so come with me to FIT to do my draping homework. And today I'm draping a dirndl skirt. So I started by mapping out my yoke on my dress form. So here you can see the finished shape of the yoke. And then I divided the waist between the center and the side seam into 3 parts and then marked pins going down the dress form to use as a guide later. Then I pinned my first piece of fabric on the dress form and I used my hand to smooth that down. Then I cut slashes along the waist and added a pinch of ease at the waist and the bottom. Then used my fingernail to kind of trace the shape. And then I went in with my pencil and marked out the shape with dots and then cross marks at any intersections. And I also marked where I had put those pins as my guide. So here's what it looked like when I took it off the form. So I went ahead and trued all my lines, creating right angles at the corners and using my hip curve to smooth out the curved lines. And I added all of my seam allowance. And here's what it looked like after adding all the seam allowance. Then I went ahead and cut off the excess. And here's how it looked. And this is how it looked back on the dress form. Then I started doing the back yoke. And I literally did the same exact thing that I did on the front, just making sure to follow along with the shape in the back and marked everything with pencil. And here's how it looked when I took it off the dress form. Then I trued the side seam and added my seam allowance to the side seam. And I went ahead and cut that out so I could pin it onto the front yoke because I wanted to make sure I smoothed the lines between the front and the back so everything was smooth and there weren't any weird points or anything. Then I made my notches perpendicular to the shape, then added my seam allowance to the back, and then went ahead and cut off the excess. Then I moved on to working on the body of the skirt, and I prepped this piece beforehand and had lots of basting stitches. Then I went ahead and divided the front and the back into 3 sections. So then I went ahead and pinned the skirt on the dress form, and I pinned at the center, front, and back, the side seam, and then pinned the marks I made in line with the pins that I put on the dress form before. Then I used my basting stitches to pull and gather the fabric, and I essentially wanted to evenly distribute it between the 3 sections, which is why I made those marks. And I'm not gonna lie, I struggled with this, and I did end up taking out the pins that were at the marks I made because they were making it hard to gather the fabric. But in the end, I made sure to line up the lines with the marks on the form. But this definitely took a lot of time and a lot of finessing to get it just right, and I wanted to make sure the gathers were lined up vertically as well. So here's how it looked after I gathered all the fabric, and then I pinned my yoke on top of that and then folded under the seam allowance so then I could go through and mark the edge of the yoke all the way around. And here's how it looked with the yoke over the skirt. Then I took the skirt off the dress form and then flattened it back out so then I could trace the shape of the yoke based on the marks I made with my pencil. So I ended up stopping there, and I just have a little bit more to do before class, and then in class we should learn how to finish the skirt, so stay tuned for part 2.